30 years ago, Karen Bray feared God. A year ago, it feared the Incubus Coal and Iron Company. Today, the fear of the Lord is getting a second chance. The originator of the Incubus Company was a far-seeing German analyst from Dusseldorf, who, upon departing this life for parts unknown, left his daughter to the senior of the present partners in the business, and his Latinised name to the great concern which had grown up at Karen Bray in the Scottish Westlands. It was 30 years since Karen Bray entered upon its present career of prosperity. Mining contracts were made, royalties were arranged, the railway brought to the works, and the tall stagings with the swiftly spinning wheels were set upon the hillside where for generations only the gowan had bloomed. McKill and Grindley were the sole partners in the Incubus Coal and Iron Company. It was Hector McKill who had wedded Sophia, the serious-minded daughter of Fritz Incob, the Dusseldorf chemist, and settled himself down to rule Karen Bray with a firm but indubitably pious hand. Grindley, on the other hand, was an unmarried man who attended to the worldly side of the connection and did the swearing in the office. He was a red-faced man with a massive watch chain of shining gold, and was not particularly attached to any of the Karen Bray Kirks. But he was known at every drinking bar within 50 miles of the pit head. Hector McKill was ruling elder in the Kirk of the Valley, and a great hand at all the prayer meetings. Indeed, it may be said he kept them up, for if his foreman did not come out to hear their ruling elder and master jerking petitions out of himself, much as though he were working a ship's pump, they might discover some fine morning that at the works of Incubus and Company there was no further use for their services. The Valley Kirk was not the fashionable kirk of Karen Bray. The county families did not frequent it, and perhaps that was one reason why it seemed to offer fairer scope for the peculiar talents of Hector McKill than the Kirk of the Hill. For one thing, the Kirk of the Hill did not believe in prayer meetings. But it had an admirable and eminently aristocratic Primrose League attached to it, and the minister was said to be shaping for candles on the altar and the eastward position. Also, most of its elders were better judges of whisky toddy than of prayer meetings. Grindley, for instance, was a member of the Hill Kirk, for he was a man of no pretensions to religion, and he found himself at home there. But Hector McKill wrought the piety end of the business to perfection. It does not do in a thriving business to overman any department, yet in the Incubus pits this division of labour wrought well. If it were desired to get rid of a man who belonged to the Valley Kirk and was a regular attendant at the prayer meetings, partner Grindley dismissed him. He had been taking up with ranters to the neglect of his proper business. If the man attended the High Kirk, or what was very much the same thing if he attended no kirk at all, partner Hector McKill called him into the office, wrestled with him in the spirit, prayed with him for his soul's good, and then dismissed him without a character. The men on the whole preferred Grindley's rough, "We've no use for you, get out of this," to the suaver methods of Hector McKill. Now, so long as the Reverend Silas Sleekman was the minister of the Valley Kirk of Karen Bray, all things went according to the will of Hector McKill. Incubus and Company had the rule all its own way. The Valley Kirk, with a splendid history of protest against the oppression of king and state, had become only the ecclesiastical arm of Incubus and Company. McKill was indeed not so imperious and autocratic in the pits of Karen Bray hillside as he was in the session of the Valley Kirk. The minister, Mr. Sleekman, was an admirable man of unblemished character, a great authority on the typology of the Book of Numbers in his way, both a gentleman and a scholar. But he was so thoroughly under the control of the blatant personality of Hector McKill that at all meetings he confined himself to saying, "I think what our dear friend has proposed will be best." The rest of the session murmured and abode their time, for they were not meant to be thus set aside. The congregation seethed in silent and helpless discontent. But there was no mistake that the arm of Incubus and Company reached far in Karen Bray, and the man who openly opposed it in the long run went to the wall. Yet somehow Incubus and Company, with all their graspings, did not seem very greatly to prosper. They paid the poorest wages, and as a consequence they had only good men in the most indispensable of situations. But there was no manner of doubt that in Job Henderson, their underground manager, they had an excellent man. He was firm with the men under him, and in consequence, at first he was not over well liked. But as the men of the Karen Bray pits grew to know Job Henderson, they found how often his calm, mild strength came between them and the wrath of the partners of Incubus and Company. It was at this time that the Act of Parliament was passed requiring all pits whatsoever to provide themselves with a second exit within a certain time under pains and penalties to be enforced by the newly appointed government inspectors. Job Henderson openly rejoiced and started the construction of the spare shaft at once. McKill and Grindley were not often down the workings, and it was some time before Hector McKill knew that the work was proceeding. But as soon as he heard of the matter, he ordered such nonsense to be stopped at once. It was a waste of money. Besides, there had never been any accident in the Carron-Bray pits, and the whole thing was wholly unnecessary and uncalled for. Surely a pit which was under the protection of the prayers of so noted a vessel as Hector McKill could come to no harm. The ruling elder of the Valley Kirk did not put this last into words, but his whole manner inferred it. Job Henderson went to lay the matter before the junior partner, Walter Grindley. He found him at the bar of the Royal, telling a sultry story which was causing uproarious laughter. To him he stated the necessity, and what had been ordered. Grindley, in a very brief manner, condemned the expense. "But the government inspector?" said the underground manager. "Leave him to me. I know how to work such cattle," said Walter Grindley, returning to the bar. So Job Henderson went back to the works and wrote out his resignation. He was a man with a family, and he did it painfully. But he could not consent to play with the lives of men. He stated the reason for his resignation in his letter to the firm of Incubus and Company. Walter Grindley laughed as he read it. "Risk to the lives of men," he said. "Well, I suppose we pay them for taking the risk, and they know it as well as we do. I never did read such cant." But the senior partner spoke seriously of it at his prayer meeting. He had been that day, he remarked, wounded in his tenderest feelings by one whom he had trusted, a serpent whom he had taken from the gutter and warmed in his bosom. Yet he was eminently sustained in his affliction, and enabled to bear it all meekly. So the spare shaft was stopped on the morrow, and a new manager came to the pit, whose conditions of service were that he obeyed orders without question, made no complaint, cut down the working expenses, and increased the profits. He was a good man, this new manager, according to his lights, but his lights were the conditions of his managership, and the continued goodwill and favour of the Incubus and Company. The shifts came and went with great regularity. The pit filled and emptied, and the narrow twin-air shaft which ran along the main incline or dock was half filled with steam pipes, for it was, according to Incubus and Company, a great pity to have an empty space which could be filled with what was useful. But one or two men, who spent their lives down there in the deeps of the earth, tightened their lips and said a prayer for wife and bairns that had little in common with the laboured paragraphs of which, on the evenings of the prayer meeting, the senior partner delivered himself before going home to arrange for cutting down his men's wages 10% all round. Then came the government inspector. The men had heard of his coming and looked for great things. The obstructions were cleared away from the bottom of the abortive second exit, which had been carried so far and then abandoned at the end of the rule of Job Henderson. But Mr. Grindley had the inspector well in hand. He had treated him generously before he came, and Grindley was the best of good company, and made himself liked when he chose. The inspector descended, admiring as he did so the perfect working of the cage, and feeling the strong draught of air. He walked along the working faces. He saw the men at their tasks. He passed the end of the partially constructed tunnel, which Grindley indicated with a wave of his hand. "Our new exit," he explained generally. "Ah, indeed, that's right," said the government inspector, for who could look too narrowly into the affairs of so pleasant and hospitable a man of the world as the junior partner of the great firm of Incubus and Company? Also, there was none to tell him that the tunnel ran up to within 100 yards of the surface and there stopped, where on the day of Job Henderson's resignation the last hole had been driven, and the work dropped to cut down expenses. "Now," said Mr. Walter Grindley hospitably, "we'd better go up to dinner. It's hot and stuffy here, and I told them to ice the champagne. You are to dine with me, of course. I arranged that. Our old man is a teetotaler, and I thought you would prefer it." And the government inspector did prefer it. So this was all that the inspection of the Carron-Bray pits accomplished, and the report was enough to certify that there was no health resort in Britain so entirely salubrious in climate and appliances as the pits of Incubus and Company. But in the meantime, the senior partner was having trouble considerable in his ecclesiastical relations. The Reverend Silas Sleekman was laid quietly away to rest from his labours in the graveyard in the valley, and there was a vacancy in McKill's Kirk, as the commonalty named it irreverently. This meant the reaching of candidates, and an exceeding interest among all the members in the election. But it was generally thought, indeed taken for granted, that, though patronage had been abolished, Hector McKill would get in his man. Mrs. McKill, the Incubus, for her own part, meant to have a young man with at least some tendencies to ritual. Hector did not much care one way or the other, but he was resolved like iron to have a man who would do as he was bidden, and who knew his place. In fact, he had found the very man. Providence had brought him to hand. There was yet another sleek man, and it was thought that the people would like a second of the breed, one of the same meekness and ineffectiveness as that Silas who had recently laid himself down to rest from labours, which apparently ought not to have tired him very much. The Reverend Alexander Sleekman was a probationer of some standing, meaning thereby that he had been out of college several years without finding a resting place for his foot in kirk or manse. But he had preached several times for his relative during the summer holidays, and Mr. Hector McKill, with that interest in the young for which he was famous, had sounded the lad and found him of a very adaptive and facile disposition. The senior partner thought this would be most suitable in a minister of the Valley Kirk, who above all men ought to be a model of humility. Mr. McKill liked all his sermons from the Old Testament, and especially rejoiced in denunciations of the wicked, which, being interpreted, meant those who did not agree with Hector McKill. On the other hand, Mrs. McKill loved expositions of the Little Horn, and the settling of the exact day and year of the end of the world. She subscribed to the Prophetic Herald, and questioned all young preachers as to their views on the literal fulfilment of prophecy. So the Reverend Alexander Sleekman satisfied both the chief inhabitants of Grip Castle, which stood among sprouting larches over the hill out of sight of the pits. He was asked there to lunch. He stood with his hat in his hand on the gravel walk when he spoke to Mr. Hector McKill, and he expressed the most lively delight at finding a copy of the Prophetic Herald, my favourite journal, on the drawing-room table. Mr. Sleekman did not mean to miss the good things of this life if he could help it. He was altogether a suitable young man, and Hector McKill said, "He'll do fine." Now, the senior partner in the great firm of Incubus and Company had not the least doubt that he should be able to carry the congregation of the Valley Kirk along with him. Indeed, that was a factor which he had not so much as considered. Were not most of the members his own employees? Hector loved the word. He was their employer, their master, and it would be a strange thing if he could not hire them to think as he thought, as well as do as he bade them do. Yet it will hardly be believed that there was rank treason and rebellion against so good a master being freely mooted in the pits themselves, and preparation was being made for the congregational meeting, with a view to disappointing his earnest and just expectations. This was a matter to which it is eminently painful to allude. We hardly like to enter into the depths which are to be found in human nature. Hector McKill made it a matter of public prayer that he should get his own way, and Mrs. McKill frequently consulted the Prophetic Herald. Who would dare to gainsay two such single-minded and powerful Christians? Now, in the Presbyterian Kirk of Scotland, a selected number of those who have been proposed as candidates for the pastorate have to preach on one or more Sabbaths before the congregation, so that the people may judge as to the merits and popular gifts of the man whom they elect to rule over them in spiritual things. Accordingly, the Reverend Alexander Sleekman reached first. He had a plaintive and monotonous voice, and he selected his text from the prophet Daniel to please Mrs. McKill. But he was far from pleasing the rank and file of the free and independent members of the congregation. They complained that he whined whenever he did not snivel. "That creature can never preach. He can only peep and mutter," said Angus Gilruth, gardener and theologian. "That piece of machinery wadna work benna when Hector McKill turned the handle," said Sandy McClymont. And so the word ran through the congregation. But Hector McKill went about the next day saying to every member and adherent he met, "You were at the kirk yesterday, John. Wasna yon a grand sermon?" And John thought that it was, having regard to the fact that he was speaking to his master. But he relieved himself when he sat on his hunkers at the pit bottom, waiting for the cage. But there was one of those who came to preach whose name was David Oliphant. He certainly did not peep and mutter. He had a message to deliver, and at least he stood and gave it forth like a man. He had long been wrestling with a poor district, where sin was the handmaid of poverty, and where prayer was not so divorced from the brotherhood of helping as it was in the theology of Hector McKill. He prayed with the people in the evening, and saw they got milk for their babes in the morning. In the Valley Kirk, he preached on the address of Paul to the men of Athens from the Hill of Mars. This agitator, he called him, this inciter of the populace, this socialistic lecturer, proclaimed his message, and the Athenians listlessly hearkened. For God hath made of one blood all the nations of men that are upon the face of the earth. And the citizens smiled at one another as they heard the new doctrine. Did the swarthy little Jew think himself of the same race as themselves? And the Roman centurion smiled behind his hand like a stalwart British policeman in his pride of place. The slave owner shrugged his shoulders and turned away. But on the skirts of the crowd, here and there, one listened and set his head nearer to catch every word. The Helot heard a new thing. Of the same blood, equal in the new faith, neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, bond nor free, all free and equal in Jesus Christ the new prophet. Swart Ethiopian and flaxen-haired Goth, they paused ere they went to their task, hearing of a new burden and easier yoke, a brotherhood of man. There was hope for them in the new faith. No wonder the common people heard him gladly, and the rich and increased in goods passed him by, for it was a Helot's faith, this of the Nazarene, and once more to the poor the gospel was preached. David Oliphant's words rang through the Valley Kirk like the accents of a new inspired prophet. Such things had never been so spoken there. The workers had been dulled into apathy. Use and want alone took them to their accustomed places on the morning of the Sabbath day. But the words of the preacher had fallen dully on their ear as something with no possible bearing upon their daily life. And as the kirk emptied itself, there were many who whispered one to the other, "We have heard a new thing today." But they said little aloud, for Hector McKill was condemning the unhallowed doctrine in no measured tones. He would write to the officers of the kirk about the men whom they had sent out to preach to vacant congregations. He had never heard the pulpit so prostituted before. It was all he could do to keep still in his place. There was not a word of spirituality in the whole discourse. The young man was a disgrace to the presbytery that licensed him. But he'll no get off with the likes of that, said Hector McKill. Yet he took him over the hill to Grip Castle for dinner, and tried to overwhelm him with his importance. But David Oliphant was not overwhelmed. He had not met the great ones of the earth in vain, and he could give a reason for the faith that was in him. He told Mrs. McKill several things about Christ and his religion which considerably astonished Hector. More than that, he had the passages at the end of his tongue to bear out his doctrine. "He said to me in the smoking room," said Hector to his astonished wife, "that there was no doubt that Jesus was a working man, and his followers socialists." "But you surely did not sit still and listen to such doctrine?" queried his wife, aghast. Hector McKill looked uneasy. He shrugged his shoulders and played with his watch chain. "But Sophia, in a manner he proved it. That was the awkward thing." "Nonsense," said Sophia sharply. "I wish I had had him through my hands. I would puzzle him with a little horn, and the time and a time and half a time." Which indeed was likely enough, for David Oliphant devoted most of his attentions to the vials of wrath which were being poured on the earth at the present time, and the horn that he was interested in was mostly to be found on the palms of the workers with whom he consorted, and in the hearts of such firms as Incubus and Company, whose employees they were. So it was decided at Grip Castle that Alexander Sleekman was to be their minister, and that Hector McKill would write to all the vacant churches and warn their committee against the life and doctrine of David Oliphant. "I owed this duty to the church at large," said Hector. "Such a wolf ought not to be allowed to masquerade in fleecy clothing amongst the silly sheep." But at the congregational meeting, a sharp and horrid surprise was waiting for this worthy and noble follower of the apostles. He proposed the Reverend Alexander Sleekman. He lauded his likeness to his worthy predecessor. He called him a chip off the old block. An irreverent person in the back benches interjected the syllable "head" at this point, which raised a laugh among the unthinking. Hector McKill repeated his observation with greater emphasis, and again the objectionable syllable came from the back of the church. Then he went on to advert to the excellent doctrine which they had heard in the discourses of Mr. Sleekman, and the admirable manner in which the preacher had settled disputed points in the prophetic interpretation of Daniel. It would be a blessing of no ordinary calibre if they were privileged in the Valley Kirk to listen Sabbath after Sabbath to such teaching. For his part, Hector McKill's part, he asked nothing better than an eternity of such Sabbaths. He concluded by proposing the name of Mr. Sleekman, and he said that were Mr. Sleekman elected, he should personally make it his business to give him all the assistance and advice in his power in fulfilling his onerous ministerial functions in their midst. It will hardly be believed, yet it is a fact, that at this point a deliberate wink was observed to pass round the congregation. Hector McKill caught Sandy McClymont in the act, and Sandy coughed and pretended that some obstruction in his throat was bringing the water to his eye. Man is by nature depraved. Then there was a pause in the proceedings, till one of the firemen at the Carronbray pits seconded his master's motion, as he had been ordered that morning to do. He kept his head down and appeared very unhappy, but he had 10 of a family and was 2 quarters back with his rent. Then, without note or comment, Angus Gilruth stood up and moved the election of David Oliphant. A member at the back of the hall, believed to be another of the pit firemen, an unmarried man, swiftly seconded the motion. The worthy moderator, who was a minister of a neighbouring church, all innocent of the complication of interests, rose to put the matter to the vote. But Hector McKill, choking with anger, was before him. He fell upon David Oliphant, his character and doctrine, with tooth and nail. His doctrine was unspeakably bad. His opposition to constituted authority showed what manner of man he was better than anything else. His character also was more than doubtful. He would be a disgrace to the parish, and for one, Hector McKill would give no support to a congregation which would cause such a man to rule over them. "I and my wife," said Hector, speaking after his manner, "have had opportunities of diagnosing his character denied to the others here present, and we can vouch that our impressions were not favourable." Mrs. McKill nodded her head violently. David Oliphant's views on the Little Horn had been very unsatisfactory indeed. "But I do not doubt that this factious opposition to such an admirable man as Mr. Sleekman, against whose character and doctrine there is no breath of suspicion, is confined to one or two irresponsible persons of no particular standing." Mr. McKill paused for a reply. The people did not reply, but every man and woman made ready to vote. Yet when the election proceeded, and a show of hands called for of those favourable to the candidature of Reverend Alexander Sleekman, only 11 could be counted. And there was even a considerable uncertainty about some of these, for as soon as Hector McKill took his eyes off several of those who voted for his candidate, strangely enough their hands instantly dropped to their sides. These were all married men with large families, and in the upper places about the Carronbray pits. The moderator indeed declared that he could only count 7 at any one time. Then came the vote on behalf of David Oliphant. A whole forest of hands arose. The moderator thought there were about 200. Hector McKill was on his feet all the time, turning round like a teetotum, trying to focus his attention upon those of his employers as were voting against him. But it's a strange thing that for every one of these whom he really got his eye upon, and by dint of frowning prevailed upon to keep his hand beneath the pew, at least 2 others, who were not so focused, held up their hands, so that the moderator could not in any way make the numbers of those voting for David Oliphant less than 210. He rose to give his decision, and was interrupted by Hector McKill. But the moderator was not under the thumb of Incubus and Company. He lived in another parish, and so he made short shrift of the ruling elder, who only managed to say that he washed his hands of the responsibility of bringing such a man into their midst. When David Oliphant came to Carronbray, he was welcomed with a great assembly in the Valley Kirk to do him honour, and down in the pits and along the working faces there was joy which did not readily find expression. And what pleased these swarthy miners as much as anything, their owner, the senior partner in the great firm of Incubus and Company, was explosively indignant, and refused to have anything to do with the ceremony. This was a capital introduction to the confidence of the workers of Carronbray, and there was a larger contingent of them at church on Sabbath than had ever been there before. But the McKill's pew was empty, and the congregation whispered to each other that Hector McKill, Lord of Grip Castle and of the serfs of the Carronbray pits, had left the Valley Kirk and betaken himself to the kirk on the hill. The Little Horn went with him. But this was not yet decided. Hector and his wife were that day deep in debate as to their future action. Should he secede forthwith, or remain to be a thorn in the side of the new minister? He could not hope to have the same authority in the kirk of the hill. On the other hand, the Reverend Septimus Easyman was ready to have any views or none upon the Little Horn, and he was entirely sound on the question of rights of employers, so that it was finally decided by the conclave at the castle that immediate withdrawal from the tainted and disgraced Valley Kirk was absolutely necessary. So Hector McKill lifted his lines and removed his Bibles during the week. Then, being without employment for his facility in petitioning, he started a prayer meeting at the offices of the company and invited those who attended to send in notices of request for prayer. But the notes received showed the evil minds of the senders. One stated that the sepulchres of the neighbourhood stood much in need of a new coat of whitewash, and urgent prayers were asked for the same. Another remarked upon the tattered condition of the hypocrites' cloaks and suggested a fresh supply. Another referred to the second exit at the Carronbray pit as a subject for Mr. McKill's petitions, while yet another suggested a rise of 10% and an examination of the insanitary condition of the company's houses. The proposed prophetical prayer meeting in Mrs. McKill's drawing-room was abandoned, and in the town of Carronbray all things went on as they had done before. The government inspector came every 3 months and strolled along the mains of the pit accompanied by the junior drinking partner. The senior whitewash partner kept out of the way. Then, at a certain fixed point, Walter Grindley proposed to return to the surface in time for dinner. So, with a magnum of champagne before him, the inspector rested from his labours and found all things very good. And David Oliphant, cleared of Incubus and Company and all their works, preached the gospel as it was given to him, and instructed his people, among other things, that the fatherhood of God meant the brotherhood of man. But on a day unforgotten in Carronbray, swift and unexpected as lightning, fell the terror of great darkness. At Carronbray Pit No. 1, the day shift had turned out at 6 in the morning, stolidly taking its way to the pit to do the day's darg. In the little red houses the men and boys breakfasted mostly with little said, and as silently rose to go, each with his dinner can along with him, into the still sunshiny morning. The men went to labour. The women abode at home, worked and waited. The laddies followed their fathers as soon as it was time for them to leave school and go to work. "Weel, I'm awa," was the most effusive greeting heard as the men shut to the doors. Yet some of the younger of them took a look at wives and bairns ere they went forth, for to all who win the coal from the deeps of the mine, there is the grim risk that they who go forth in the morning with head erect may be brought home before ever evening come with drooping head and feet that are carried first through the door. So, in scattered groups, fathers with their boys walking manfully by their side, sometimes running a few steps to keep up, and single men in silent companionship with their mates, they took their way up the hill to the pit mouth. The wheels spun round opposite ways on the tall scaffolding. The cage sank and rose. The engineman pulled his levers and tested his throttle valves. Down to the bottom of the long dark shaft, and along the incline, the parties of men and boys sped to their work. Tools clinked as the men lifted them to their shoulders. 1,500 feet beneath the yellow cornfields, 1,500 feet beneath the great house of Grip Castle, where Hector McKill, senior partner in the firm of Incubus and Company, was not yet out of bed, lay the workings where the picks began to play a merry tune. The pony boys brought the waggons quickly along the dark underground ways. Here and there the lamps glimmered and danced over the mounds of rubbish. From the abandoned workings there came strange faint smells, and the lamp flame sometimes forsook the centre wick and seemed to cling strangely to the wire of the davy frame. Few of the men in that great pit remembered as they wrought that the yellow sunshine of the autumn day slept above them, for the pit hummed like a hive, and there was little enough time for thought. The door boys heard the whistle of the men running the coal trucks through the dark passages and threw back their doors. Then, with a yell and a gust of wind, a long line of cars rushed through the open doorway. Sometimes one of the men upon them would wave a hand kindly to the lonely boy left by himself in the darkness, and the flames of their hat lamps streamed back like the smoke track behind a railway engine. Suddenly, that day in August, as the boys were bringing their loads of coal to the bottom of the Duke, John Roy, the bottomer, looking upward, saw thick volumes of smoke pouring down the shaft of the long incline. "The pit's afire!" was his quick and terrible cry. There was but one way to the surface, but one to the outer air, and the flame had gripped it, as John Roy well knew when he saw the red glow in the heart of the smoke. Now, doubtless it was his duty to bide by his signals, for the bottomer is the man at the helm, and only he can communicate up that long incline, nearly a third of a mile in length, with the men in the engine house on the surface, whose levers and wire ropes control in turn the movements of the cage, by which alone safety can be reached. But John Roy had little time to think. Bewildered, stunned, not knowing which way to turn for the blinding downpour of smoke and the crackling of the deadly fire among the timbers of the pit, he leapt into the cage and stood with his hand on the bell lever. But before he belled himself away, he called to the 3 boys who stood beneath with their loads ready for the trucks. "The pit's afire, lads! Come away with me!" Then these 3 lads, whose names deserve to be written in golden letters, though no more than boys in years, returned to the bottomer the answer of brave men. They said, "No, we'll gang and warn the men." John Roy jerked the lever thrice and was whisked through the smoke and fire just in time, leaving the 100 men below to their fate. But the 3 boys sped on their way. The weight of many men's lives was on their boyish hearts. Breathing deep to give them vigour, they ran through the gathering smother, which instead of feeding the great pit with pure air, was carrying down the deadly smoke all along the faces of the pit. They raced with bent backs under the black archways. Every moment they were risking their own lives to warn their comrades. "The pit's afire! Run, men, run!" they cried, and at the word each man and boy dropped his tools and ran for the bottom of the incline. But when they arrived there, they found only the red fire glowing down from above on the dull waters of the sump, and the cage gone, which ought to have been there to take them to safety. Some started for the air shaft, but it was blocked with steam pipes, and no man could climb 30 yards up it. The legal second-hand exit had, as we know, never been driven, and 100 yards of solid rock lay between. So down there, men and boys were penned, with the great fire roaring in their only exit. They were no better than rats caught in the trap set for them by Incubus and Company, and baited with 30 shillings a week. But the senior partner was a pious man, and had often prayed for them, only he had not finished the second exit. The thought must have been a comfort to them at that moment. But on the plans of the pit, approved and passed by the government inspectors, there were splendid exits, wide and clear. All was completely arranged on paper. It's a pity that men cannot escape on paper. And above, in the sunlight, women wailed and wept and watched and waited. Through the long and anxious August night, the womenfolk, many of them with their babies, stood about the pit head. Hector McKill, in a white waistcoat, moved among them, telling them they had better go home, they could do their men no good. Suddenly, a woman broke down, and the weird, unforgettable sound of the Irish keen went out on the air. It nearly broke the hearts of those that heard it. Grief among the Scottish women was quieter, more patient, stiller. But when the dead carts began to rumble and the bodies were brought home, the women broke loose from all restraint and clambered on the wagons crying for their husbands. Then David Oliphant, who had gone from house to house, ran along to meet each cart, and reverently laying the cloth aside, he identified the poor clay, and so drove the husband home to his wife's fireside, which he had left sound and well that morning. Yes, the boys had warned the men. The 3 heroes who thought of no Victoria Cross had done their deed, and now they lay quiet, one in his father's house, with the deadly reek oozing stilly out of his nostrils, another as quiet, the only son of his mother, and she a widow. But one lay at the bottom of the black water of the sump, so deep that even the ruddy fire scarce glimmered down upon him. But the boys had warned the men. On a quiet Scottish Sabbath they were laid in their resting graves on a breezy hilltop, looking down on the place that had been their death trap. The fields over them were yellow with the corn, but under the sheaves 50 men lay buried in a deep common grave. They had a service on the green, and the lift of the widowed and orphaned voices as they sang their psalm almost broke our hearts. Yea, though I walk through death's dark vale, yet I fear no ill, for thou art with me, and thy rod and staff comfort me still. And at the open-air service, behind the rows of weeping women, the children played upon Carronbray Green, or stood staring opened eyes as at a show, with never a father among them. But Hector McKill went to the church with a conscience void of offence. He had subscribed £100 to the relief fund. Now David Oliphant had a word to say, and he said it. I do not stand here to apportion blame or to decide legal quibbles, but I say that the men who are responsible for failing to provide a way of escape for these men are responsible for the loss of these 100 lives, and one day shall have to answer for the murder before the bar of God. 2 mornings after, David Oliphant found on his table a legal letter from the solicitor of Incubus and Company. The letter informed him that he had laid himself open to an action for libel and requested the name of his solicitor. David Oliphant had no solicitor, but he had an answer, and his answer ran thus. I specially declared in my address that I had nothing to do with apportioning blame before human tribunals, and I shall rejoice to meet your clients at the bar which I mentioned on the great day when the secrets of all hearts shall be revealed, when all wrong shall be righted and all evil punished. David Oliphant's faith was simple, but like many simple things, it wore well and carried him through. He heard no more of the action for libel. The water had filled the mine. It was 7 months before it was again pumped out of the flooded pit. Then, once more, the explorers entered the dread place where the smoke choked, the fire burned, and the water drowned so many lives that were bright and young. They are again at the pit bottom. They pass along the dripping passages from which the great pump has sucked the water. They clamber over falls of rock which have thundered down from the roof. They shade their eyes and hold up their lamps as they go down the slope. Stop! What's that? This is what they see, dark shapes leaning against the wall, some sitting as if in thought, some resting at ease as if asleep, some lying prone on their faces. I declare, said one of the searchers, they were sitting there after 7 months under water, as if they were waiting for the oversman to call the next shift. He was right. The great oversman had called the next shift, and every man had answered to his name. One little lad had run upon the first alarm to find his father. The men who lifted him had strong arms, but the tears ran down their cheeks upon their grimy hands. And well they might, for the boy lay lovingly and confidingly with his head upon his father's knee. He had found his father. Perhaps so had they all. At any rate, it was better to die with them than to live with Hector McKill. Incubus and Company still survives, but does not greatly prosper, though Hector's white waistcoat is broader and whiter than ever. But, though he got clear in the government inquiry, the Great Court of Appeal has not done with him yet. There is a certain white throne to be set up, and even if there be no hell, as the newfangled folks say, God is going to set about making one specially for Hector McKill.